What if I told you that one of France's most celebrated war heroes, a man who fought beside Joan of Arc and stood proudly at the coronation of a king, would later be remembered as one of history's most prolific child killers? This is not a legend. This is not a ghost story whispered in a darkened tavern. This is the true descent of Gilles de Rais, a man whose name once shone in the chronicles of chivalry, but whose soul would rot in the shadows of his own castles. Before we peel back the stone walls and see the horrors beneath, I have to warn you, this journey will not be easy to take. But if you want to know how a saint's companion became a devil in human form, hit that subscribe button, because we are about to walk through the gates of hell. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405, cradled in the lap of opulence. His family's estates spread across the fertile lands of Brittany and Anjou, dotted with fortresses and rich farmlands. From the moment he could walk, the boy was surrounded by tutors, fine clothing, and the murmur of servants bowing to his every whim. Fate, it seemed, had marked him for greatness. When both his parents died while he was still a boy, Gilles inherited a fortune so vast that even the kings of Europe might have envied it. Jewels, gold-sprawling castles, the treasures of generations, flowed into his hands. Yet wealth to him was never enough. He craved something brighter, the blaze of glory on the battlefield, the roar of victory ringing in his ears. At just 16, he entered the maelstrom of the 100 Years' War. His armor gleamed beneath the sun, his banner snapped in the wind, and he fought with a ferocity that shocked seasoned commanders. Sword in hand, he cut through English lines with the precision of a man born for war. The French army whispered his name with respect. Then came the year 1429, and with it a figure who would alter the course of his life forever, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc. She claimed that God himself had sent her to crown the Dauphin as King of France. The court laughed, the nobles scoffed, except for Gilles. Something in her eyes of burning certainty drew him in. He pledged his sword, his men, and his immense wealth to her cause. Together, they marched into history. Gilles rode at Joan's side during the siege of Orléans, his blade flashing in the sunlight as the English faltered. He was there at Reims when the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII, and the bells of the cathedral thundered across the city. On that day, Gilles stood near the throne itself. His armor gilded his head high, a living emblem of French victory. By 24, Gilles de Rais had everything a medieval man could dream of: titles, lands, riches, and the highest military honor France could bestow, Marshal of France. The church blessed his name. Minstrels sang of his valor. He was the golden knight of his generation. But dreams, especially those in the Middle Ages, have a way of curdling into nightmares. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the English. The following year, she was burned at the stake. Gilles watched the fire take her from afar, unable or unwilling to stop it. Something deep within him shattered. The man who had once charged into battle with divine purpose began to vanish from public life. He withdrew to his estates, shutting out the world. At first, the changes seemed harmless, even eccentric. He staged vast theatrical productions that consumed fortunes, filling great halls with silks, music, and actors from distant lands. His banquets overflowed with exotic dishes, peacock-spiced wine, rare fruits served to hundreds of guests who left shaking their heads at his extravagance. Then the whispers began. Strange men in long robes were seen entering his castles at night. Books of alchemy and occult symbols appeared in his libraries. Villagers spoke of flickering lights in the lower halls, of faint cries that carried on the wind, and of a coldness that seemed to seep from the very stones. And then, children started to disappear. At first, the disappearances could be explained away, so the servants said. A boy had been sent to learn a craft in another town, another had left for a choir in a distant parish, a third had run away to the sea, yet the parents received no letters. The parish kept no records. and the sea returned no names, only the echoing silence that clings to gates which never again open for small eager footsteps. Those who dared to ask questions found themselves ushered into antechambers and fed polite lies with sugared wine. The steward's voice was smooth, the accounts meticulous, the signatures beautiful, and what peasant would accuse a marshal of France when even the local magistrate bowed so low his words vanished into the rushes on the floor? Something within Gilles was curdling into obsession. Gold could not fill the chasm. Joan's death left behind. Applause could not drown the whisper that purpose had fled. So he chased shadows alchemists who promised transmutation, astrologers who promised destiny, and grim books that promised power to the one who bore them into locked rooms where even candle flames seemed to hesitate. His household learned a choreography of fear doors that were never opened without permission, corridors kept lit at all hours, ledgers rewritten by trembling hands, and a furnace that burned too often for a house without smiths. The smoke slipping into the night like a confession no priest would absolve. Rumors flowered in the villages like poisonous nightshade. A tanner's family searched for a missing apprentice. A miller's wife swore she heard distant crying carried by the river, and the parish priest. Quiet, stubborn poor began to assemble names in a little book because when you cannot fight a lord with sword or coin, you fight him with memory. Meanwhile, Gilles' fortune, once seemingly inexhaustible, began to bleed. Properties were mortgaged, then sold. Jewels vanished into pawnbrokers' ledgers. Creditors multiplied like crows on a battlefield. And yet he staged one more spectacle, ordered one more pageant as if applause could pay debts or drown out the knocking at the gate. Debt is a kind of truth that even lords must bow to, and in 1440, the truth arrived in the robes of clerics and the seals of notaries. When a dispute over church property turned to fury, Gilles seized a cleric and held him by force, an act so brazen it snapped the cord of protection that rank and memory had long tightened around his throat. With that outrage, the pretext became a mandate. The bishop's men and ducal officials converged upon his strongholds. Parchments unrolled, writs read aloud, spears tipped like needles of daylight. And for the first time in years, the castle learned a new sound, the clatter of authority that did not ask permission to enter. Behind doors, the dust had guarded for seasons. The searchers found rooms that swallowed sound instruments, whose purpose needed no labels, ledgers with names that stopped mid-line scraps of cloth carefully folded, as if the past could be kept small. The air was heavy, the walls were damp, and one soldier later swore that the silence itself felt bruised, as if the stones remembered what words could not bear to say. What followed was a trial in 2 theaters, ecclesiastical and civil, a spectacle of parchment and pain, where servants spoke and parents wept, and officials counted what could be counted and stared past what could not. Some argued that confessions under threat were tainted, yet the testimonies multiplied until they formed a weight that even politics, even wealth, could no longer lift. Day after day, the court heard the same pattern repeated like a dirge. A child enticed with promises of service or song. A feast offered a chamber, prepared a silence that followed. The voices came from peasants and from servants, from men hardened by toil and women broken by grief, and though their accents differed, the grief in their words was the same. Some of Gilles' own retainers, their faces pale beneath the vaulted ceilings of the courtroom, described the rituals in chilling detail: fine clothes given to the children, prayers forced into parodies, and then the moment when kindness twisted into cruelty. They spoke as though lifting stones from their chests, and each stone landed heavily in the hall. One servant named Poitou recounted how Gilles silenced cries with his own hands, how the chamber was sealed so thickly that sound could not escape, how afterward the fire was stoked until nothing recognizable remained. The judges listened, quills scratching on parchment, and the crowd shifted uneasily as though the very air were accused. Others testified to seeing strange volumes of alchemy in the library, hearing incantations muttered beneath their breath, witnessing candles arranged in circles and powders burned with acrid smoke. The suggestion was clear. Gilles had not only abandoned the light of God but invited something else into his halls. When Gilles himself was called to speak, his demeanor was unnervingly composed. At first, he denied with a soldier's pride and a noble's contempt for the whispers of peasants. Yet, as the examinations wore on, and as the threat of excommunication and torture loomed, his words began to change. What followed was a confession so graphic that even the hardened scribes lowered their eyes. He described his methods, his twisted fascinations, his strange exhilaration at the brink of death. The court, expecting evasion instead, received a torrent of words that seemed to relish in their own horror. Some whispered that this was not true repentance but performance, a final act in the theater of his life, an attempt to shock to control, even as he stood condemned. Yet others believed that at last the mask had fallen, and the monster within spoke plainly. The judges deliberated, though the outcome was never in doubt. The pile of testimony was too high, the outrage too fierce, the church too eager to wash its hands of him. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of heresy, sodomy, murder, and crimes unspeakable. On the morning of October 26, 1440, the city square of Nantes filled with a sea of faces. Families who had lost children stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants, soldiers, and clerics. All eyes fixed upon the scaffold where Gilles de Rais, once the Marshal of France, now a condemned criminal, awaited his fate. The rope tightened around his neck, and when the trap was released, his body swung before the crowd. Then, in accordance with the sentence, the flames rose, consuming cloth, then flesh, until smoke and ash carried his name into the sky. For some, it was justice. For others, it was the belated cracking of a dam long too silent. Yet, death was not the end of Gilles de Rais. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a legend too dark to erase. The church tried to strike his name from the chronicles, omitting him from accounts of Joan of Arc's campaigns, as though silence could cover the stain. But silence is porous and stories seep through. For years afterward, families still whispered his name in cottages and taverns, warning children not to stray too close to lonely castles or follow strangers with promises of food. His memory became a ghost that haunted Brittany's forests and villages, a cautionary tale disguised as folklore. By the 17th century, writers had transformed his crimes into the famous tale of Bluebeard. The details were softened: wives instead of children, a locked chamber instead of dungeons, but the skeleton of the horror remained. The wealthy noblemen who lured innocents to their deaths lived on in fairy tale ink. Ironically, in this new form, Gilles became a story told to children, bedtime warnings spoken in hushed tones, never revealing that the tale itself was born from a man who preyed upon children. What was once too real became just a story, even as reality bled beneath the surface. But historians did not forget. In dusty archives, they uncovered depositions, accounts written in trembling hands, inventories of crimes that read like grim ledgers. Each parchment pulled him further from legend and back into the harsh light of truth. Modern criminologists would later look at Gilles as one of the first documented serial killers. His rituals, his victim selection, his cold detachment, his escalation, all elements that would become textbook patterns centuries later. It was as if his depravity had written a manual no one wanted to read. The tragedy is that the very traits that made him a hero, ruthlessness, charisma, unwavering belief in his own superiority, were the same that made him a perfect predator. Society had celebrated these qualities in war, and then recoiled in horror when they were turned inward upon the innocent. Medieval France itself bore responsibility. A culture that glorified violence gave unchecked power to nobles, and silenced peasants created the perfect storm. Gilles de Rais did not need to hide in shadows. He was protected by walls of privilege until even the church could no longer pretend. And so his story remains not just the tale of a single man, but of a society complicit in its own nightmare. The applause of crowds, the indulgence of kings, the blindness of priests, all formed the silence in which children disappeared. Today, his name is still spoken with a shudder. His castles still stand as silent witnesses, their stones holding memories too heavy for words. Gilles de Rais is a reminder that the line between hero and monster is thinner than we wish to believe, and that the most dangerous predators often wear medals before they are unmasked. Long after the flames of his execution had cooled pilgrims visiting, Brittany claimed they could still sense a heaviness in the air near his estates. The ruined halls seemed to exhale a cold draft even in summer, as if the stones themselves remembered every scream that once echoed there. Local folklore embroidered his story with supernatural colors. Some said his soul had been dragged into the earth by demons at the very moment of his death. Others swore they saw his figure wandering the battlements at night, clad not in shining armor but in shadow, searching for the children he had lost to the fire. But behind the myths, the historical reality remained stark. His wealth had been squandered on vanity, his genius in war twisted into obsession, his faith perverted into occult rituals. Gilles was not simply bewitched or cursed, he was the consequence of unchecked privilege allowed to fester in secrecy. Generations of historians debated whether he was framed a scapegoat destroyed so his creditors could inherit his lands. The timing of his trial arriving precisely when his debts reached their peak was suspicious, yet the sheer weight of testimony from villagers, servants, and clerics was almost impossible to dismiss as fabrication. His own confessions added a disturbing layer. Even if obtained under threat, the vivid detail, the relish with which he described his actions was chilling. It was not the language of a man pleading innocence. It was the theater of someone performing his own monstrosity before the world. And that performance left a legacy far beyond his lifetime. Writers, poets, criminologists, even psychoanalysts returned to Gilles de Rais as a case study in human depravity. They found in him the blueprint of the modern serial killer: deliberate selection of victims, ritualized killings, escalation over time, concealment through status. He became unwillingly a mirror held up to society. The traits celebrated in a knight: courage, dominance, unshakable confidence, when detached from compassion, transformed into cruelty, arrogance, and indifference to suffering. Gilles de Rais embodied both extremes, showing how thin the boundary truly was. In many ways, the tragedy was collective. For years, peasants whispered suspicions, yet few dared confront him. Local authorities looked the other way, intimidated by wealth and reputation. Even the church ignored the growing shadow until forced by circumstance. Silence, more than any spell or curse, allowed the crimes to multiply. Thus, Gilles de Rais' downfall was not just the fall of one man, but the collapse of an illusion. The illusion that nobility guaranteed virtue, the titles equaled honor, that a hero on the battlefield must also be a guardian in peace. His story tore that illusion apart, leaving only ash and memory. Today, when visitors stand before the remnants of his castles, they are struck not by grandeur, but by an uneasy quiet. The walls no longer boast of victory or wealth. They whisper instead of complicity of forgotten children of a hero who became the villain of his own tale. As centuries passed, the legend of Gilles de Rais morphed into a warning wrapped in folklore. Parents invoked his name to keep children from wandering at night, just as later generations would whisper about wolves or witches. His story was a reminder that monsters did not always lurk in forests, they could live behind castle gates. The Bluebeard tale, polished into a fairy story by Charles Perrault in the 17th century, softened the edges but retained the essence: a wealthy man hiding corpses in secret chambers. Few who read the story realized that beneath the fabric of fiction lay the truth of Brittany's cursed noblemen. This transformation from history to myth was itself an act of survival. Societies prefer to process horror through allegory. It is easier to tell children about a wicked husband than to confront the reality of a knight once praised by kings who slaughtered the innocent by the dozens. Yet, in archives, the raw testimonies never faded. Parchments preserved the trembling handwriting of clerks who recorded every word of the trial. Lists of names, fragments of lives, whispered prayers caught in ink. These documents remained silent witnesses waiting for future generations to read them with fresh horror. By the 19th century, scholars revisiting the case began to debate again. Was Gilles truly guilty of every charge, or had his enemies inflated his crimes? Some painted him as the victim of a political conspiracy, a man destroyed by debt and by the church's hunger for land. But even the most skeptical voices could not ignore the sheer consistency of the witness accounts. Over 100 testimonies, many overlapping, many describing specific victims, converged into a chorus too vast to silence. If there was exaggeration, it still rested upon a foundation of undeniable truth. And so, Gilles de Rais remains an unsettling paradox, a knight honored as a hero and condemned as a fiend. He was both a symbol of France's victory beside Joan of Arc and the embodiment of its darkest nightmare, a contradiction so jarring it continues to fascinate and repel historians today. The lessons of his life stretch beyond medieval France. They warn of the dangers of blind hero worship of institutions that protect the powerful, until it is far too late of societies that look away because the truth is too uncomfortable to face. Every culture has its own Gilles de Rais, cloaked in respectability, celebrated in public, but hiding secrets that once uncovered force everyone to ask how silence endured for so long. His story is a mirror, dark, cracked, unavoidable. And perhaps the most chilling realization is this: Gilles was not an aberration outside his world, but a product of it. The violence, the unchecked power, the indulgence of nobles, the silence of peasants all combined to create him. He was not the exception. He was the consequence. In the quiet centuries that followed, the world moved on, wars ended, kingdoms shifted, empires rose and fell. But the story of Gilles de Rais never disappeared completely. It lived in whispers and ballads, twisted into cautionary tales, in the uneasy silence of villages that still pointed toward the ruins of his castles with a shudder. Travelers passing through Brittany reported the same uncanny atmosphere: fog clinging longer to the fields, birds avoiding the towers, locals crossing themselves when his name was mentioned. It was as though the very earth had absorbed his crimes and refused to release them. Some even claimed that children in the region dreamt of him. Centuries later, visions of a tall figure in armor, his face half lit by firelight beckoning them toward shadowy halls. These were only stories, of course, but they showed how deeply his infamy had carved itself into cultural memory. Meanwhile, historians began to look at him not just as a medieval curiosity, but as a lens through which to understand power and corruption. Gilles embodied the danger of authority, unchecked, a man wrapped in privilege so thick that no one dared to question him until the damage was irreversible. Modern criminology would come to define terms like organized serial killer, ritualistic offender, and psychological escalation. Yet, 600 years earlier, Gilles de Rais had already written those definitions in blood. He was in a chilling sense ahead of his time. The paradox is unbearable. The same man who fought for the salvation of France beside a saint also engineered its darkest crimes. His life was a pendulum swinging between sanctity and damnation, proof that human beings can embody both extremes with terrifying ease. And therein lies the warning. The most dangerous monsters are not the ones we imagine lurking in forests or nightmares. They are the ones standing beside thrones wearing medals and basking in applause. Gilles de Rais was not a stranger to society, he was its darling, until the day the mask fell. For all the centuries that have passed, his story still forces uncomfortable questions. Who today hides behind titles and reputations? What horrors do we excuse because the perpetrator wears the face of authority? How many times has silence paved the way for tragedy? The tale of Gilles de Rais endures not because of its gore, but because it reveals a truth larger than one man. Power without accountability is a breeding ground for evil. And when society worships heroes blindly, it risks creating the very demons it fears. So, the next time you hear the legend of Bluebeard, remember the man behind the myth. Remember the hero who became a butcher, the knight who turned into a nightmare. And remember, too, that the thin line between saint and monster is not history's problem alone, it is ours.